Elena lived in the hushed corridors of the past. As an archivist for the small coastal town of Oakhaven, her days were spent cataloging the forgotten, yellowed deeds and photographs of a world that no longer existed. The archive was a sanctuary of silence, smelling of old paper and dust. It suited her. Eleanor preferred the stillness of things that had already happened. Her cottage on the edge of the cliffs mirrored this isolation. It was a place where the fog often swallowed the horizon, reflecting the grey uncertainty of her life. Friends had long since stopped calling, tired of a woman who seemed to be perpetually waiting for a ghost. The ghost's name was Julian. 10 years ago, the local news was dominated by the inferno at the Miller's Creek warehouse. It was a terrifying blaze that lit up the night sky for miles. Julian, Elena's younger brother, had been working late that night. When the smoke cleared, investigators found only twisted metal and ash. No remains were ever recovered. Julian was declared dead, a victim of a tragic accident. But for Elena, the lack of a body meant the wound never closed. She had spent a decade trapped in the amber of that final night, mourning a man who had vanished into thin air. It was a rainy Tuesday, a day as unremarkable and gray as any other. Elena found herself rushing home, her coat collar turned up against the biting wind. She stopped at the communal mailbox, her fingers fumbling with the damp latch. Inside were the usual suspects: a utility bill, a grocery circular, and a plain, cream-colored envelope. There was no return address and no postmark. It looked as though it had been hand-delivered in the dead of night. Elena stood in the rain, staring at the front of the envelope. Her name was written in dark ink. Her breath hitched. The handwriting was unmistakable. The E was jagged, with sharp angles, while the A at the end was looped with a distinct lazy tail. She knew every curve of his script perfectly. Was it a prank? Some cruel, delayed echo of a life lost? Or was it something far more impossible? Before we continue this journey into the shadows of Oakhaven, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elena retreated into the safety of her kitchen, her hands shaking. She stood by the table, clutching the cardstock as if it were a lifeline. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper with one sentence. The fire didn't start the end. It started the clock. Tucked behind the paper was a heavy object that clattered onto the wooden table, a small, rusted skeleton key. Attached by a piece of twine was a tag with the handwritten numbers, Room 402. The cryptic message sent a chill down her spine. The mention of the fire felt like a cold hand reaching out from the grave. She walked toward the window, her mind racing through 1,000 scenarios. As she pulled back the lace curtain, her blood turned to ice. Parked directly across from her driveway was a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. It sat idling, its exhaust a faint plume of white. The engine hummed low and menacingly. It wasn't a car from the neighborhood. It was a predator in wait. The moment she had touched that letter, her safety was shattered. Someone was watching her every move. And the clock Julian spoke of was already ticking toward an unknown and dangerous destination. Eleanor drove through the biting rain, her knuckles white against the steering wheel as she navigated the winding coastal road. The seaside inn sat on a jagged cliff edge, a decaying monument to better days that the town of Oakhaven had long since outgrown. Its neon sign flickered with a rhythmic hum, casting a sickly green light over the peeling gray paint and overgrown weeds. She entered the lobby, where the air was thick with the smell of salt, damp wood, and neglect. The elderly clerk behind the desk didn't even look up from his newspaper when she asked about room 402. His voice was a dry rasp as he informed her that the room had been paid for in cash, month after month, for 10 long years, while yet no one had ever been seen entering or leaving it. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the creaking wooden stairs. Inside, room 402 was a time capsule of dust and shadows. It was sparsely furnished, with a single bed and a heavy oak dresser that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. She knelt on the threadbare carpet, her fingers searching for the loose floorboard she sensed must be there. In the far corner, tucked beneath the shadow of the dresser, her fingertips caught on a slight protrusion. The rusted skeleton key from the envelope fit perfectly into a tiny, hidden lock. With a groan of protesting metal, the compartment opened. Beneath the wood lay a small metal box. Inside was a collection of ghosts that stole the breath from her lungs. She pulled out Julian's old silver watch. At its glass face shattered and its hands frozen at the exact moment the warehouse had exploded 10 years ago. Beside it sat a thick stack of $100 bills and a manila envelope. Elena spilled the contents of the envelope onto the floor. They were photographs, grainy and candid, taken from a distance. They depicted a prominent local politician, a man who had stood at the podium during Julian's memorial service, meeting in secret with the very men who had owned the burnt-out warehouse. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. It wasn't a tragic accident. The fire had been arson, a calculated move to destroy evidence of a massive embezzlement scheme, and Julian had been the whistleblower who saw it all. He hadn't just disappeared. He had been forced to erase his own existence to keep the truth from burning the entire town down. He had chosen a living death, a decade of silence and shadows, to ensure that the people he was exposing wouldn't come for Elena next. He had become a ghost to keep her a person. Tears blurred her vision, but the sound of a slamming car door outside snapped her back to the present. As she peered through the grime-streaked window, she saw the black SUV idling in the lot below. Elena scrambled out of the room, clutching the metal box to her chest. The chase that followed was a blur of adrenaline and sheer terror. The coastal road twisted like a serpent, flanked by sheer drops into the churning Atlantic. The SUV loomed in her rearview mirror, a dark, faceless beast intent on ramming her off the asphalt. She pushed the gas pedal to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the fog thickened, turning the world into a wall of oppressive white. Only her intimate knowledge of these treacherous turns allowed her to take a sharp, unlit path into the trees, momentarily losing her pursuer in the gloom of the pine forest. Leaning against the steering wheel to steady her breathing, Elena pulled the original letter from her pocket once more. She held it up to the dim dome light of the car, noticing for the first time a faint, embossed watermark in the corner of the heavy paper. A stylized lighthouse. It was the Blackwood Light. As children, she and Julian had spent every summer there, imagining the abandoned structure was their private fortress. It was their secret base, the only place Julian had ever felt truly safe from the world. She drove with her headlights off, guided by childhood memory and the rhythmic, sweeping pulse of the distant beacon. The old lighthouse stood tall and desolate against the crashing surf, a sentinel of stone. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar, whining on its hinges. Elena slipped inside, the air smelling of kerosene and cold stone. She climbed the spiral staircase, her footsteps echoing in the hollow tower. On the third landing, she stopped dead. This wasn't a ruin. A worn leather jacket lay draped over a chair, and on a small wooden table sat a ceramic mug, a thin wisp of steam still rising from the dark liquid inside. He was here. He was alive. "Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking with a decade of suppressed hope. "Julian, I'm here. I found it." A floorboard creaked heavily behind her. Elena turned, a sob of relief forming in her throat, all expecting to finally look into her brother's eyes. Instead, she stared into the cold, calculating gaze of a man she had trusted for years. It was the family friend, the lead detective who had handled the original fire investigation. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing against the moonlight, holding a handgun fitted with a long, black silencer. The man who was supposed to protect her was the one holding the trigger, and the look in his eyes told her that Julian wasn't the only one who was supposed to be a ghost. The detective's face, usually a mask of paternal concern, was now a map of cold, calculated ambition. The kindness she had leaned on for years was revealed as a predatory strategy. He didn't lower the weapon as he explained the horrific truth. He hadn't just covered up the tragic fire, he had harvested the survivor. Oh, Julian hadn't been hiding, he had been enslaved. For a decade, the detective had used Julian's death as leverage, forcing him to perform shadow work that a badge wouldn't allow. Julian was a ghost who did the detective's dirty work, a man without a name who could infiltrate places a policeman couldn't touch. But the ghost had grown weary. Julian had stopped following orders, and the detective couldn't allow a loose end to remain. He had followed Elena, knowing she was the only bait strong enough to lure the ghost out. A metallic scrape echoed from the gallery above. A figure descended the ladder, moving with a heavy, painful limp that spoke of old fractures. When he stepped into the beam of the beacon, Elena's heart shattered. It was Julian, but he was a hollowed-out version of the brother she remembered. His face was a tapestry of burn scars, and his eyes held a hollow stare that suggested he had seen the depths of hell. He looked only at Elena, a flicker of the old warmth returning to his expression. He stepped between his sister and the gun, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He offered the detective a deal, his life and silence, if only Elena was allowed to walk away. He pleaded for her preservation, offering himself as a permanent prisoner to save her from the darkness. But Julian had never intended to surrender. As the detective smirked, Julian's hand gripped a heavy brass lever near the central rotation gear. He had spent weeks preparing this sanctuary. With a sudden heave, he jammed the mechanism. The massive glass lenses groaned, and a shower of sparks erupted as the motor stalled, sending a blinding, deconcentrated flash of light directly into the detective's eyes. In the chaos of the strobe-like environment, Julian shoved Elena toward the door, screaming for her to run. He explained that the clock was a countdown to exposure. He had already sent the photographs and the digital trail of the politician's embezzlement to the national press. The email was timed to go out automatically. The truth was already airborne. The sirens arrived like a chorus of salvation, blue and red lights cutting through the coastal fog. Julian's failsafe, a direct tip to the state police, had worked. As officers swarmed the lighthouse, the detective was tackled, his career ending in the click of handcuffs. Julian didn't try to flee. He collapsed against the stone wall, the adrenaline fading to reveal the toll the years had taken on his broken body. Elena knelt beside him in the damp grass, holding his hand as paramedics stabilized him. He was alive, though he was bound for a hospital and eventually a courtroom to answer for his forced transgressions. The lie that had defined her life for a decade had finally evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. The ghost had finally come home. Months later, the air in the archives felt lighter. Elena sat at her desk. The smell of old, dusty paper no longer felt like a shroud. She placed a new photograph into a personal file. A candid, beautiful shot of her and Julian in the hospital garden, his scars fading and a genuine smile touching his lips. The politician was in prison, the detective was awaiting trial, and the town was finally healing. As she moved to close the folder, her phone vibrated. An unknown number flashed on the screen. Elena hesitated for a brief moment, her thumb hovering over the glass. She knew that the truth didn't just end a story, it started a new one. With a steady breath, she answered, ready to face whatever the next chapter held.